Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. Sleeves. I would say that in all my years of teaching, that the thought of setting in a sleeve seems to be the most dreaded task in all of garment construction. Zippers, but sleeves. I'm not completely sure why, but there's a very spatial element to installing a cylinder with an angled end into a circle, and to complicate things, the cylinder is bigger than the circle. As with everything I've covered so far in my YouTube tutorials, if you know the science behind something, execution is so much easier. Let's start with defining a set-in sleeve. There are lots of different shapes to sleeves with all kinds of descriptive names, and it is important to know how each one of them sets into the garment body. Raglan sleeves, drop shoulder sleeves with a very shallow cap, batwing sleeves, gathered sleeves. They all have a different appearance and function and are installed differently. Today's focus is on the construction and installation of a set-in sleeve into a jacket. I've been constructing two jackets here, one from hand-woven fabric and one from a commercially purchased Harris tweed. Although the instructions say to work on the bands next, I've chosen to talk about sleeve installation and kind of go a little bit out of order because the hand-woven jacket is going to get a band with piping, and the piping is going to become a closure, and so there's lots to talk about there. And then the Harris tweed jacket is going to get a collar with a bound buttonhole. So we have lots to cover with many parts. For today, I want to talk about set-in sleeves. First, let's talk about the shape of the sleeve itself. If you look at the sleeve in pattern form, you'll see two sides for the underarm seam that will ultimately be sewn together, creating a cylinder. And you'll see that the top of the sleeve arcs up into a curve that will span from the underarm to the shoulder. There are three important markings in the sleeve that need to be understood. Actually, when I learned to sew, there were usually 5 markings, extra dots that helped keep the shape where it belonged. So let's start with the one at the very top. This marking or dot indicates the shoulder. This dot should bisect with the shoulder seam line. I should mention that typically in a commercial pattern, the markings on the sleeve are notches that extend past the cutting line. I learned by experience a long time ago that these notches are pretty worthless when cutting a hand-woven fabric, and they also get in the way of a seam finish. And the habit of clipping into the seam allowance to mark the location of the notch, as some do, is not recommended in a hand-woven. Instead, when I am working with a commercial pattern with notches, I move those markings to the seam line in the form of dots. All my patterns have armhole markings in the form of dots on the seam line. Now, before I continue, I want to address a bit of anatomy here. You'd be surprised how often this comes up. Because of the way the back shoulder curves up and over, typically the distance from the underarm seam up the back to the shoulder is longer than the same seam line in the front. And you can see when I match the underarm seams in this back and front of my jacket that the back is definitely longer than the front. This, of course, is exacerbated as we age and our whole spinal posture begins to curve forward. There are pattern fixes for that, which I will cover in a later video, but for now, I just like to focus on getting the sleeve into the garment. There is a pair of markings towards the base of the armhole rise that helps note where to begin the E-stitching that will ultimately form the cap of the sleeve. What's really important here is having a way of indicating which is the front of the sleeve and which is the back, because we've already mentioned that the back of the sleeve is longer than the front for anatomical reasons. Standard industry notation is to indicate the front of the sleeve by a single notch and the back of the sleeve is defined by a double notch, or in this case, dot. When transferring the markings to the fabric, I've used tailor's tacks here, which I've covered in another video. I've made sure to put one tack indicating the front of the sleeve and two tacks side by side indicating the back. And of course, they correspond to the armscye or armhole markings on the seam line of the jacket front and jacket back. The next step is to set the E-stitching around the cap. This will allow the cap to be drawn up to create a beautiful sleeve head at the top of your arm. It's important that your sewing machine be able to create a basting stitch. Nothing fancy, just a nice long stitch. Usually the longest your machine will do, 6 to 7 millimeter would be wonderful. If your machine only goes up to a 4 millimeter stitch length, well, then that's what you have to work with. I know I've been a stickler for back stitching, but in this case, not only do you not want to back stitch, you want to make sure you start with nice long tails. Begin stitching at the front dot marking using the longest stitch that your machine will do, making sure to hold the tails of the top thread and the bobbin thread so that they don't get caught. Stitch right along the seam line, around the cap, across the shoulder, and down the back of the sleeve until you reach the double dot. Remove the sleeve from the machine and leave long tails and cut the thread. Now you're going to repeat this step for a second row of stitching. Begin again at the front dot with long machine basting stitches, again leaving a long tail, but this time place the needle halfway between the stitching line and the cut edge. This is a physics thing. The two parallel lines of stitching will ease up a seam more effectively and more evenly than a single row of stitching. Now I've gone ahead and finished off the underarm seams of the sleeves with a Hong Kong seam finish, which I've covered in a previous video. Just a note, since both of these jackets will be lined, the inside of the sleeve will not be visible at all, and it would seem that a Hong Kong seam finish is sort of overkill. You might not need to finish off those edges at all if your fabric is somewhat stable, like this Harris tweed, or you can just stitch along the edges with the grain to keep them from unraveling. And I have covered that in a previous video as well. In case you're still confused about grain lines, you would be stitching widest to narrowest, which means the underarm to the lower edge of the sleeve. Now, sew the underarm seams of the sleeve together. We covered sewing seams in a previous video. Remember to pin what you know and make the rest fit. And then you're going to press the seam open, which we've also talked about in the video on sewing seams, and use either a sleeve roll or our little seam stick to help support the sleeve seam while you're pressing. Now, I've had a lot of students ask why they can't set the sleeve in first and then sew the side seams and underarm seams later. In fact, that sort of construction is actually a thing, but it's reserved for a drop shoulder garment, like a man's shirt sleeve, which has little or no cap in the sleeve, like my 1700 tunic. You can see there is little rise in the cap of the sleeve based on the underarm position. But this is about manipulating two very opposing shapes. And for best results, create the sleeve first and then set it into the armhole of the jacket. It isn't hard, I promise you. First though, it makes sense to finish off the lower edge of the sleeve while you still have just the sleeve in your hand. When you have the bulk of the entire jacket in front of you, it can get quite cumbersome trying to put a Hong Kong seam finish on a lower edge now in the round. Again, because both of these jackets will be lined, this is a bit overkill, but in case you don't want to line your jacket, it's good to know how to do this. So we're going to start with a bias strip and fold one short edge in about 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters. With right sides together, place that short fold against the underarm seam line at the lower edge of the sleeve and place a pin to get things started. You'll want to keep the binding facing up under the presser foot, so if you have a free arm machine, that can help. I don't, so I find that working with the sleeve inside out is a bit easier. Using your presser foot as a guide or a piece of black electrical tape, we've talked about that in earlier videos, stitch between 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeter to 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the lower edge, all the way around until the binding overlaps the original fold. And you'll finish stitching all the way across. We've covered applying a Hong Kong seam finish in a previous video. Now we're going to wrap the binding around the back of the lower edge of the sleeve and stitch in the ditch to secure. And that's it. The lower edge is finished and it can be turned up as a hem when the time comes. And there's no need to trim the excess binding along the back of the seam finish because, well, it's just going to sit tidy in the hem once it's turned up. Probably the most complicated part of putting in a sleeve is the orientation. And there is a trick here. Make sure the sleeve is turned right side out. And here is the most important step of all. Look and see that you have the correct sleeve for the correct armhole. Look for the dots. There's the single dot and there's the single dot. Once you know which sleeve goes into which armhole, turn the jacket inside out. Place the sleeve, which is right side out, inside the jacket, bringing the top of the sleeve towards the armhole of the jacket. It's a bit of spatial gymnastics, but you'll soon get the hang of it. In my previous video about sewing seams, I talked about pinning what you know and making the rest fit. We'll be using that technique here as well. With right sides together, match and pin the underarm to the side seam line. Look for the front dots on both the armhole and the sleeve. Match and pin them. Find the shoulder dot on the sleeve and match and pin it to the shoulder seam line of the jacket. Now, I'm a little blind here because I have an epaulette on the shoulder. So poke a pin through the back of the shoulder and you'll find the seam line. And then move around to the back of the armhole and match and pin the double dots. The underarm of the sleeve and the armhole should match up perfectly together, or 1 to 1, as I like to say. Pin these two areas together. So now we've pinned everything we know is correct, and now we need to make the rest fit. You'll see that the circumference of the cap of the sleeve is larger than the actual armhole opening. How much larger it is depends on the design of the sleeve and the intended look. The goal here is to create a sleeve head at the top or cap of the sleeve. So the next step is a little counterintuitive. You'll begin to grab both of the tails of the basting thread near that front dot. And I am working from the inside of the sleeve. Gently pull on them together to draw up the basting thread lines as a pair and push all of the ease towards the top of the sleeve. The ease resulting from drawing up the tails will rest at the top 4 inches or 10 centimeters across the cap of the sleeve, centered on the shoulder dot. This will create the head of the sleeve. The question I get asked all the time in classes is, if you want the ease only at the top, then why do you start pulling the threads all the way back at the bottom of the armhole? The easiest way to explain this is by explaining how you approach a curve when driving a car. You don't step on the brake when you're at the curve. You gently slow down and ease into the curve. Again, it's a sort of physics thing. So working from the front dots, continuing obviously right sides together, match the sleeve to the front armhole with a 1 to 1 ratio, keeping the grain lines in the sleeve from any distortion. And this is super easy to see because I'm working with a very striped fabric. Keep pushing any excess ease towards the top as you pin. Carefully distribute any ease across the top 2 inches in front of the shoulder dot. Any excess beyond what fits here can just be pushed towards the back. You want it smooth with no puckers, but the warp threads are definitely drawn up. Getting this delay smooth is important, and what's really important here is that the armhole of the jacket should not be distorted or gathered in any way. The body of the jacket should remain smooth and unobstructed. The sleeve fits into the armhole of the jacket, not the other way around. Repeat this step and start working from the back double dots. Grab the tails and gently pull the basting threads, pushing all the ease towards the cap. Match and pin the back of the sleeve to the back of the armhole until you get to the top, and then spread that ease across the cap. And again, check to make sure there is no distortion in your grain lines as you work up the side of the armhole. And once again, all of the ease is distributed 4 inches across the cap, 2 inches on either side of the shoulder dot. Now, there's a bit of controversy in the industry, of course, there's controversy in everything, about which side should face up when actually sewing in the sleeve. The theory is that because the feed dogs in the machine can actually help ease an area that's slightly bigger. The sleeve should be face down onto the feed dogs, and the wrong side of the jacket armhole would be up under the presser foot. I know the theory, but more than 50 years of sewing with the sleeve facing up so I can actually see what I'm doing makes it really hard for me to embrace that practice because I'm sewing blind. So do as I say, not as I do. Always start by machine basting in the sleeve. I start sewing at the underarm and I work my way around the sleeve, through the shoulder dot, and back down to the beginning. Stitch on the seam line, and don't worry about any previous basting like the ease stitching that might show, because that's easy to remove later. Once you've inserted the sleeve, check it. Try it on, see what you think. Make sure you haven't caught anything untoward. Make sure there is no distortion in any of the grain lines as they come up the side of the garment. Look at your cap. Make sure you have a really nice sleeve head there. And of course, check the back. Again, make sure there's no distortion in any of these grain lines. And actually, if you have to fix something, because it's basted, any area that doesn't look right can be easily fixed. So the goal is, again, that the sides of the sleeve as they move up the armhole are smooth and that the grain lines are not distorted. All of the ease should be right up at the cap, forming a nice head on the sleeve. There should be no gathering and no puckers. You will find actually that this whole process is a breeze because hand-woven fabrics go anywhere you put them, effortlessly. This is where the real joy of working with hand-woven fabrics comes into play. Once you've set a sleeve into hand-woven fabric, you'll wonder what all the fuss was about. So once you're satisfied with the fit of the sleeve into the armhole and all of the ease is across the cap only, go ahead and restitch the sleeve with a regular machine stitch. And for security, because the back of the sleeve is especially subject to a lot of stress, put a second row of permanent stitching if you think that would help. Do not ever trim the seam allowance of a set-in sleeve in a hand-woven jacket. Ever. The seam allowance will need to be steamed towards the cap of the sleeve, and that will help create a smooth sleeve head. For this part of the process, we have a cool tool, which we've already talked about in part 2 of darts. This is a tailor's ham. It's starting to show signs of wear, and if your ham is old from the 70s or the 60s and it's really showing a lot of wear, as in here, go ahead and recover it. Just take a piece of wool and turn it under and hand stitch it all around the perimeter. You get a new cover. So this is a tailor's ham, and it substitutes for body parts when steaming and shaping areas of the garment that aren't flat, which is probably most of the jacket. Almost everything in a jacket has shape. Stand the ham on its butt end. There are actually stand holders for this, and I used to have one, but somehow it disappeared when I moved the studio. Push the rounded top of the ham into the armhole from the inside of the jacket so that the rounded top simulates the top of your arm. Push the seam allowances of the sleeve seam towards the sleeve. Now, gently steam and finger press the shape into the top and sides of the sleeve. The iron shouldn't actually touch the fabric. You want a nice soft roll, a good head, and you don't have to do anything with the underarm. That seam allowance just stands up. Now that you have a perfectly lovely set-in sleeve, you get to do the whole process over again for the other sleeve because there's nothing like practice. If you're going to line the garment, no further action needs to be taken on the inside of the sleeve seam allowances because they're going to be covered. But I'm going to cover putting a finish on the inside of the seam allowances anyway because not every jacket needs to be lined. Now, at this point, you should be a pro at finishing off seams with a Hong Kong seam finish. And because many of us are in the menopausal years where the jacket comes off, the jacket goes back on, and then immediately off again. I especially love having an unlined jacket, and I always strategically toss the jacket onto a chair with the inside open to impress everyone with my mad finishing skills. Start at the underarm, as you did at the lower edge of the sleeve. Fold a piece of bias and lay that fold even with the underarm seam. I usually work from the jacket side of the garment. Apply the bias as a Hong Kong seam finish all the way around the armhole and overlap the bias at the start. Since both sides of the sleeve seam allowance are technically visible, stitching in the ditch once the binding is wrapped around will produce a raw edge, and even though the bias doesn't ravel, it will look unfinished. So instead, I fold under the bias as I wrap around the seam allowance and hand stitch in place. Setting in a sleeve takes practice. Understanding how sleeves work and where the ease should go helps a lot to make the process easier. And hand-woven fabrics make the process really easy. I'm Daryl Lancaster for The Weaver Sews.